my thanks to the organisers. It's gratifying to know that the issues we are discussing are on the public policy and business agenda here in Malta, and I'm most impressed with the content of the introductory speeches from all three so far. So I think my job, a little bit, is to give a European perspective, to use some of the same data and some of research at European level, perhaps to challenge some of the assumptions about active ageing, and in particular to clarify for me and for you, I hope, some of the challenges specifically here in Malta. I'm coming from Eurofound in Dublin. Eurofound, as the chairperson said, is a European Union agency. But it's a little bit different to most European Union agencies because the governing board of the foundation is composed not only of representatives of government from all 27 member states, but also representatives from the employers' organisations in each member state and representatives from the trade unions in each member state. So you can imagine that the interest of the governing board in active ageing is very much about active ageing and the labour market, active ageing and employment. And over the last 20 years, the foundation has been doing work on the issue of ageing in the workforce, as well as ageing in the population, and looking at strategies, particularly in companies, to enable people to work longer. We began work, in fact, in 1993, and some of you may remember that 1993 was a European year. It was the European year of older people. No intergenerational solidarity, but the European year of older people. And as our contribution in Eurofound to that European year, we began research on the issue of age management in companies. And in 1996-97, produced the first tranche of company experiences in an EU that was then composed of only 15 member states. But we repeated this exercise 10 years later, 2004, 5 and 6, with 27 member states, including Malta, of course, and we produced a database of company practices to enable workers to stay in employment for longer. A database of what we called good practice. And one of the things I want to say first of all is that good practice was not then terribly easy to find. And it's not now found everywhere, by no means. So when I present examples of positive measures for an ageing workforce, I think we must acknowledge that they're not found in all sectors or in all businesses. More recently, we run something called the European Working Conditions Survey, and I shall present some data from that. And in the last two surveys, in 2005 and again now in 2010, we've focused a little bit specifically in the survey on older workers. And next month, during the closing ceremony for this European year of active ageing, we'll be launching a new report on the ageing workforce and the working conditions of the ageing workforce. And I'll return to this again at the end, but it is, I think, another issue that we need to address. How good are the working conditions for older workers in Europe? What's the quality of the jobs that older workers are doing? And this report will tell us quite a lot about that, at least in 2010. I'll also say something from two recently completed pieces of work across member states. The first one, fortuitously, looking at income from work after retirement. I think it's most interesting that the organisers of this conference chose the theme of working beyond retirement. As you will hear, my emphasis is rather upon working until retirement age. But the theme of working after retirement is something I will pick up later in my presentation. And finally, I will also try to say something about what I believe is this very important issue for older workers, about reconciling their employment with care responsibilities, not so much for their grandchildren or children, but for their spouses and for dependent older people. And again, what companies can do about this. You've already heard some data presented from the special Eurobarometer on active ageing, and I shall present a little bit more. But first of all, just to be clear that the concept behind active ageing in Europe certainly puts employment and paid work at the centre. But it's not all about employment and paid work. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that active ageing is about the contribution that older people are making in different ways to the community, to the family, and to the country and economy in which they live. So it's about working in employment, but it's also about working in the community and volunteering. It's also about working at home and in the family, providing care and support to others. And in the special European survey to launch the European year, people were asked in all 27 member states what their views were on the contribution that older people made to society. Now, older people in this case includes me and all other people over the age of 55. But the question in the barometer asked people whether older people played a small, a moderate, or a major role in the economy, in the local community, among their families. And you can see from these data that there are, first of all, very big differences in the perspectives of citizens in the different member states. On the whole, and in all countries, most people say that older people, people aged 55 and over, play a big role in their families. And most people say that they play a significant role in the local community, although that's not true in all countries. And the example of Hungary is quite stark. But the number of people who think that older people play a significant role or a major role in the economy, in paid employment, shows the most differences between member states. Now, I don't know very much about Malta, even if I will present some data on Malta. And now looking at these data, I'm quite surprised that so many people in Malta think that older people play a major role in the economy, because we'll look at employment rates in a moment. Nevertheless, on the whole, for Malta, the proportion of people thinking that older people play an active role in society tends to be somewhat above the European averages. And in general, this is a different sort of question, asking people how and in what ways older people contribute to society. And again, in general, comparing Malta with results from the EU27, you can see that people on the whole tend to acknowledge the role and contribution of people aged 55 and over at a somewhat higher rate than the European average. Highest of all, of course, is taking care of grandchildren, but also you see 70 and 75% or more of people believing that older people in Malta play a significant role in financial support for families, carers for sick or disabled, and indeed as workers in a paid job. The lowest proportion or the lowest visibility appears to be for volunteering. So that's the background. Those are perceptions, relatively recent results from a 2011 survey. If we now turn and look at data from the European Labour Force Survey, you look at the employment rates in the EU27 by age group and by gender. And here are the figures from 2001 and 2011 for men and for women. These are the data for the EU27. And I think it's not surprising and fairly obvious that there is a decline in participation with age. It's also quite obvious that the employment rates of men are higher than those for women in all age groups. And I've included here the age group 65 to 69. When we talk about working beyond retirement, it's really actually very difficult in practice to define when retirement is. But for our purposes, let's say it's 65 is the standard age for state pension in most member states. So the people working beyond the age of 65, in principle, we could say, are working beyond retirement. And you see here that the figures have increased between 2001 and 2011. They're higher for men than for women. But they are a significant contribution. On the whole, about 1 in 10 people beyond the age of 65 and up to 69 are still or have re-entered paid employment. And I'll return to that population later, since they're of particular interest here. But I'd like to just divert to say one word, because I think Dr. Schwireb spoke about dependency ratios. And I know you all know what dependency ratios are, but I want to emphasize that they're only a statistic. They simply tell you what the relationship is between the number of people over the age of 65 and the number of people aged 15 to 64. Those over 65 are called the dependent population. Those 15 to 64 are the working age population. Well, I suppose that's quite interesting, but first of all, a lot of people in the working age population aren't working. And that's a problem, but that's a somewhat different issue. And amongst those over the age of 65, quite a number are working. And I think it makes no sense for us to be scared by the dependency ratio as such. Dr. Schwireb gave the figures that everyone gives. For Europe at the moment, it's 1 pensioner for 4 workers. In 2030, it'll be 1 pensioner for 3 workers. And in 2050, there'll be 1 pensioner for every 2 workers. Yes, but who's working? How many hours are they working? How productive are they? You can see here there's a huge potential for increasing employment at all ages. And I think the Commission has done a good job in its white paper on pensions by looking at something called the economic dependency ratio, not this crude demographic dependency ratio, and I applaud them for doing that. Those are the figures for the EU27. Now let's look at older workers in the 27 member states. From the Labour Force Survey, on employment rates of people aged 55 to 64 in 2001 and 2011. And the first thing you can see is that the employment rates of older workers have increased. In fact, in all member states except Portugal and Romania. Secondly, you can see there are very big differences between countries in the employment rates of older workers. At one extreme, Sweden, Germany, and Denmark, with the highest employment rates in 2011, and at the other extreme, Hungary, Malta, and Slovenia, with the lowest employment rates. The official employment rate for Malta in 2011 is 32%. So we have to bear that in mind. 32%, less than 1/3 of people aged 55 to 64 are in paid employment. The argument I want to make mostly today is that that is an enormous resource of people who potentially could be in paid employment. If Malta had the rate of paid employment amongst older workers that, say, Finland or the UK has, it would be closer to 55%. So these differences are very significant. And countries are starting from very different points. I don't want to make a crude distinction between East and West, but if you look at the countries at the bottom end of participation, they include many of the new member states. Also, big countries like Italy and France. But I'll come to that again in just one moment. So the employment rate is obviously one figure that we want to keep in mind. The second figure we want to keep in mind is the average age at which people are leaving the labour market. We talk in Europe a lot about extending working life. And usually, what we mean actually is trying to bring the real age of exit, the effective retirement age, closer to the statutory retirement age. And let's suppose that the statutory retirement age on the whole is 65. In the EU27, the average age at which people leave the labour market is just over 61.4 years. So they're leaving the labour market 3 and 4 years on average before the state pension age. Again, big differences between countries, and in Malta, the average age of exit in 2009, which were the most recent data I could find, was 60.4 years. Somewhat below the European Union average. But again, very big differences between member states. These figures matter for all sorts of reasons, but just please let me illustrate one. And this is the story about what's going to happen to the working age population over the next 40 years. In demographic terms, we can be quite precise about what's going to happen over the next 20 years because we're referring to people on the whole who are already born. But these are Eurostat's projections up to the year 2050, when you'll remember we're supposed to have one pensioner for every 2 workers. But the first thing that's going to happen to the European working age population is that it will fall on average. And in some countries, it will fall massively by more than 20%. The second thing that's happening to the working age population is that it is getting older. So the proportion of people aged 55 to 64 in that population is generally increasing, in some countries very strongly, by more than 10%. Now these again are demographics. These are the story of the numbers. Not the story of the people who are in employment, but the story of what that working age population, age 15 to 64, looks like. And in general, you can tell that it is a smaller working age population and an older working age population. So in general, we need to be preparing human resources, working conditions for an older workforce. It's not true in all member states. In Malta, according to these data, the size of the working age population goes against the general trend. So in Malta, some increase expected in the working age population between 2005 and 2050. I come from Ireland, and that's also one of the countries expecting an increase in the working age population. In Malta, though, also moderate increase in the ageing of the workforce. But if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, You find there the Czech Republic, Estonia, Greece, Spain, Latvia, Hungary, Portugal, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, Lithuania, and so forth. These are, on the whole, the countries with the lowest current employment rate of older workers, and where, you might say, there is least experience at managing age and an ageing workforce. And I think that calls for urgent attention. Some of this, of course, is not new, and over the last number of years, member states have been responding to the changing demographics by seeking to extend working life. And very briefly, you can see that governments in most member states have taken some sort of action, particularly around changing or adaptation of social protection systems. Many member states, maybe Malta also, with pension reforms, increasing statutory retirement ages, changing the retirement age for women to equalise with men. Is that the case? Yeah. So this is the picture across very many member states. Changes in pensions, changes in access to early retirement, no longer being subsidised by the public purse, changes in access to disability and incapacity benefit schemes. So really providing disincentives to leave the labour market early. Secondly, a number of more active promotion measures to improve prospects for older workers to stay in employment for longer, promoting training and education programs in some small number of member states, programs to change attitudes towards older workers, quite a lot of public advertising and targeted campaigns to reduce discrimination against older workers, and indeed, of course, the introduction of age discrimination in employment. Initiatives in very few member states that we could find involving collective agreements, involving the social partners working together, employers and trade unions, developing collective agreements around, for example, working conditions for workers as they age. Some examples in the Netherlands and in Germany. Some examples particularly on the learning and education from Finland. But finally also measures to encourage companies to address ageing in their own workforces. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the name of Ilmarinen from Finland, who's been working for a large number of years with companies on what kind of strategies they can develop to essentially improve working conditions for workers as they age, promoting their workability and capacity to stay longer productively in the workforce. Measures very often, of course, around training and skills development, education. Very many initiatives thinking about ergonomics, work design and work organisation. Increasingly efforts to maintain and improve the health of the workforce as they age, and Ilmarinen is particularly strong in this area. And more recently, measures to change corporate culture, to change attitudes towards older workers, to think about human resources more globally, and under that to think about issues around reconciliation of work with family life. When we began our activities in 1993 and did the work, the surveys and the case studies in 1995, we drew up a guide to good practice in age management. Subsequently, we have rewritten that guide following the work in 2005-2006. Anything I refer to, by the way, is available free on the Foundation's website. And we essentially talked about good practice in age management around these sorts of themes around recruitment, obviously training and lifelong learning, career development, a big area around flexible working practices and work organisation and working time arrangements, more conducive to the capacities and preferences of workers as they age. Initiatives around health promotion and protection. And interestingly, because we're about to do more work on this, initiatives around redeployment of workers in the business. Classic examples being those with heavy lifting jobs doing other tasks in the same organisation that weren't as physically demanding. And in the two big case study exercises we did, we found more companies involved in more comprehensive measures, but we also found what we call contradictions, which is to say companies who had good practices for their workforce as they aged, and at the same time, early retirement options. We found ambivalences in the sense that companies would have really positive measures around training, for example, but pay very little attention to maintaining the health or the well-being of workers as they aged. And we found what we call ambiguities in the sense that companies appeared to have positive measures for their aging workforce, but they were only for some groups in the workforce and not others, or some sectors of employment in the company and not others. Between the 1995 and the 2005 research, again, we found most measures were around training and development, followed by flexible working. We found that measures became increasingly complex and increasingly comprehensive over time. Between 1995 and 2005, some sorts of initiatives became more popular in companies, such as a focus on health and promoting well-being. And some measures became apparently less common, particularly around specific measures to recruit older workers and redeployment. We still found that some groups in the workforce were more likely to be targeted with positive age management than others. And it applied particularly to skilled manual workers and increasingly professional workers, with less attention to low-skilled workers, and rather little focus on gender issues, which I will come to again in a couple of minutes. Since 2005, we did more research in companies in 2010, following up those who had good practices to find out what was happening to their good practice during the financial crisis. During the financial crisis, as you know, employment rates for older workers have remained relatively stable across the member states. We're all very familiar with the massive decline in the employment of young workers, but employment rates for older workers have not increased further, but they've remained relatively stable in the last 5 years, although, of course, still with very big differences between countries. In individual companies, we still found some use of early retirement, which companies were trying hard not to use when we visited them in 2005. But on the whole, where there were age management policies and age management practices, they continued, with some changes. In 2010, were finding more attention again to skills, promoting the employability of older workers, investing in the skills and training of older workers again. For the first time that we noticed, there was also more evidence of what we're calling intergenerational knowledge transfer. That's to say, the involvement of older workers more often as mentors, as coaches for younger people, something which I really believe is now happening on a wider scale and which is very promising for both older workers and for companies. And we found more or increasing attention to flexible working arrangements, with a serious effort to introduce partial retirement schemes that kept people in employment for longer. You all know, I'm sure, that a number of partial retirement schemes in the past actually encouraged workers to work full-time for a period and then retire. The idea of these partial retirement schemes was to keep people working and enjoying some benefits of retirement. This is now the audience participation part of the presentation. Question to the audience. Do you think you'll be able to do your current job when you're 60 years old? All of you who think you could still be working at the age of 60, please put your hand up. If you're still alive. So, Chair, what do you think? Oh, it looks like 70%. Very impressed. 70%? That's most impressive. Here are the results. Not from you, but from the European Working Conditions Survey. I don't know if you can see it. Just over half of people in Malta, we interviewed 1,000 people in work and asked them, could they still work when they were 60? And the answer was half of them thought they could, which is somewhere in the middle. In the Netherlands, the figure is closer to 75%, but there are many countries with a smaller proportion going down to 40%, thinking they can stay in employment for longer. The analysis suggests that working conditions are very important in determining whether people feel they can work longer, so that those who are most exposed to hard physical labour environments with lots of movement and so forth and heavy carrying are less likely to feel they can stay longer. That's not very surprising. Those who felt they'd experienced discrimination or abuse or bullying were less likely to say they could stay longer. But also important were issues like work-life balance and their perception that they could have interesting careers and interesting work. These are all very, very important. What we call here the cognitive dimensions of work are very significant for people's views on whether they can work for longer. If you looked at the data by countries, you'd also, of course, find that there was a strong relationship between people's perception that they could work at 60 and the current employment rate of older workers. So there is also a cultural dimension that in some member states people are more likely than in others to feel that working beyond 60 is something that we do or would like to do. My question to you, question 2. Would you like to continue working after the age at which you are entitled to a pension? Hands up those who would like to continue working beyond the age at which they're eligible for a pension. This is shocking. This is newsworthy. 50%, including younger age groups as well as those in older age groups. These are the results from this Eurobarometer survey in 2011, and it's not surprising that overall 54% of people said they didn't really want to work beyond pension age. They wouldn't be interested in it. I wouldn't have been surprised to see that. What we found surprising was that 33% of people said they would like to work beyond pension age. In fact, in Malta, overall, only 23% of people, this is from a sample of 1,000 again, only 23% said they would like to continue working beyond pension age, and 63%, which was a big number compared to other countries, said they didn't want to think about working beyond pension age. Again, you see big differences, but these are the results that you can look for in the special Eurobarometer report. I'm going to come to a close now with just a few words on the two themes. Mayor? Yep. First of all, just a little word more on this working after retirement, and again from the EU survey, and again as was mentioned earlier on, a majority of people think that people should be allowed to continue working beyond pension age, and a majority of people reject the idea of mandatory retirement. And not surprisingly, perhaps, there was an association here between the employment rates of young people and attitudes to working beyond retirement. But as I said at the beginning of my talk, when we are looking at employment rates, this phenomenon of working beyond retirement age is more and more prevalent in nearly all member states. Here are the figures from 2006 and 2011 from the Labour Force Survey on the employment rates of 65 to 74-year-olds. 65 to 74. Paid employment rates. Huge variation, but altogether an increase from around 8% in 2006 to 10.5%, to 9% in 2011. Altogether, if we look at the younger age group, 65 to 69, not 65 to 74, we find the employment rates have gone up from 8% to 11% today. So more than 1 in 10 people between 65 and 69 is in paid employment. Big differences between countries. I'm sure you can see Malta. I can't give you the data for 2006 because we don't have it for Malta, but for 2011 the figure is around 4.5%. I should say, marketing moment, that these data are being presented in a report that will be launched on December the 5th about working beyond retirement in Europe, and it again will be free to download from the Foundation website. And there you'll find that working after 65 is increasingly popular. It's more common amongst those who are closer to retirement age, 65 to 69. It's particularly something that people with higher education are doing, but also people with low skills and medium skills. It has been mainly men working beyond 65, but an increasing proportion of women are also now working beyond 65. And it has involved a lot of self-employment. Self-employment sometimes because there's no alternative, but also self-employment because the pension isn't adequate, because there are, we were surprised by this one, because there are succession issues in companies. People are self-employed and their children or nobody else actually wants to take on the company. So they keep on working. Self-employment because they like the job and they find it meaningful. Overall, we find very high rates in some occupations in some countries. So agriculture in Romania, fishermen in Portugal, and at the other extreme, academics in Sweden, female entrepreneurs in the UK. The lowest proportions of working beyond 65 are in public administration. And why are people working beyond 65? Partly because they want to. They're interested in the job. They enjoy the sociability. They have a conviction that this is the way they want to spend their time, and they find it valuable to work beyond 65. Partly because they need the money. And they need the money sometimes because pensions have fallen or are not adequate, and sometimes because beyond 65 they suddenly find themselves with increased costs. Children are unemployed, they have to help out. Healthcare costs arise for some members of the family. So there are both incentives to work beyond 65, and the third element, of course, is there have to be jobs that they can go to. There have to be employers who are interested in usually retaining, but sometimes recruiting workers beyond the age of 65. But of course, we are asked so often what proportion of people are doing it just because they need the money. They would do anything. They have to have a job. And it's not the answer, but in the European Social Survey, which is a really very good survey, they asked people of all ages, basically, whether they worked in their current job only because they needed the money or for other reasons. And rather surprisingly, only 1/5, 21% of workers over the age of 65 said they did it for the money, or only for the money. 33% of older workers and 34% of workers aged 14 to 54 basically said they wouldn't do their current job if it wasn't that they needed the money. I conclude, and I know it's now running out of time, with just a quick word on work-life balance. I think this is very important. Not only do we have an ageing workforce, but the older workforce is increasingly female in nearly all member states. Secondly, not only do we have an ageing workforce, but we have an ageing population. And for a significant number of older workers, 13 to 16% of women older workers, there are issues of reconciling work with care responsibilities for dependent family or friends. And we need to change our focus on this, because this, as Ilmarinen has recently discovered, is a very important problem for older workers, and particularly those working beyond retirement, that they have responsibilities outside work. And at the moment we have very little action being taken by companies to support workers with care responsibilities, even though there are examples of good practice which are in a recent report from the Foundation, principally around flexibilisation of working hours, having more part-time work and longer care leaves, partly companies who are trying to help workers to do their job and to suffer less financial disadvantage if they have to take time off to do care work, with payments during emergency leave and topping up social benefit payments. And we even have examples of companies who are trying to help their workers to do their care work, helping them to find advice and information, to identify services and facilities. At the policy level, the practical level in companies, my short message is we do need to raise awareness still among employers and among trade unions, but also among workers, of the issues surrounding the ageing of the workforce. Secondly, where we do have initiatives in the workplace, we need to make sure that workers know about them and feel comfortable about taking them up. I think particularly in the workplace or in employment, there are many opportunities still for employers and trade unions to work together in social dialogue and in collective bargaining to improve opportunities for the ageing workforce. In future, I think that we need, in discussing work up to and beyond retirement, we need to take more seriously the idea of the life course perspective, where we think about working and learning and caring and maybe also volunteering throughout working life. Secondly, I think we must develop the potential of the intergenerational approach. The idea that it's not only initiatives for older workers, but initiatives for workers across the life course, and initiatives that bring together younger and older workers. Often we hear about the benefits of mixed-aged teams. We've got quite good examples of learning and skills exchange between older and younger workers. But I do think that recent examples of mentoring approaches and the role of older workers in coaching younger workers are very promising indeed. I think we need to rethink our ideas on career. One point I agree with from Mr. Schwereb is that there's not necessarily a contradiction between jobs for younger workers and jobs for older workers. But I think there's a second issue, which is that as we all stay in employment for longer, people in their 40s are increasingly going to look and say, I am where I am and I'm not going to go much further, because now the people who are moving on and moving out are staying put. And I think there's a very important issue about maintaining interest, call it motivation, call it commitment, of workers in mid-career, and a need to think about internal mobility and second careers. I also would have some questions about research. And I think, given our focus on employment, given our focus on ageing, I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.